There is a cave in northern Nevada that most people have never heard of. It sits quietly in the desert, about 20 miles southeast of a small town called Lovelock. On the surface, it looks like thousands of other geological formations scattered across the American West, dry, unremarkable, baked by sun. But what came out of that cave between 1912 and 1924 has been quietly debated by archaeologists, anthropologists, and independent researchers for over a century. The reason this topic keeps coming back, the reason it refuses to stay buried, is not because of one dramatic discovery. It is because of a pattern. A pattern of physical remains that do not fit neatly into the accepted framework of early North American habitation. A pattern of documentation that raises more questions than it resolves. And a pattern of institutional responses that have, over time, left more gaps in the record than most people realize. What makes Lovelock Cave worth examining carefully is not the most extreme version of the story, the version that gets passed around online with exaggerated claims and dramatic music. What makes it worth examining is the more quiet, more stubborn version, the physical measurements, the excavation reports, the oral traditions of the people who lived in that region long before any archaeologist arrived, and the documented chain of custody of the materials that were recovered. Across multiple independent sources, field reports, newspaper accounts, academic publications, and the oral history of the Northern Paiute people, certain features keep appearing. Unusual skeletal proportions. Hair samples that laboratory analysis described as reddish. Artifacts that suggest a level of material sophistication inconsistent with the assigned cultural period. And a historical record that, when examined closely, contains a number of inconsistencies that have never been fully addressed. This video does not argue that any single interpretation is correct. What it does is walk through the documented record, layer by layer, and ask a straightforward question: do the known facts, taken together, require a better explanation than the one currently on offer? That is the only question worth asking here. And it is a question the evidence, not speculation, will guide us through. Lovelock Cave was not excavated by professional archaeologists the first time it was disturbed. It was mined. A commercial guano mining operation began extracting bat dung from the cave around 1911 for use as fertilizer. Workers removing that material began encountering artifacts, woven baskets, carved decoys, tools, and human remains at significant depth within the cave's floor deposits. By 1912, the University of California had been notified, and a formal excavation was organized. The lead excavators were L. L. Loud and later M. R. Harrington, whose 1929 report remains one of the primary academic documents on the site. What those excavations recovered, in measurable and catalog terms, is the starting point for everything that follows. The cave itself is substantial, roughly 150 feet deep and 35 feet wide at its mouth. The deposits excavated reach down several feet, with lower stratigraphic layers corresponding to significantly older occupation periods. The oldest materials recovered have been dated, through subsequent radiocarbon analysis, to approximately 2500 BC, with some organic materials suggesting even earlier presence in the region. Among the human remains recovered, several sets were noted as being of unusual physical proportion. The Harrington report and associated field notes describe skeletal material with femur lengths and cranial dimensions that, when calculated against standard anthropometric formulas of the time, suggested statures in excess of 6 feet, with at least some specimens estimated between 6 feet and 6.5 feet tall. In the context of populations typically documented in the Great Basin during that period, this was considered noteworthy enough to record explicitly. Hair samples were also recovered, some still attached to desiccated remains, others found loose within burial deposits. These samples were described in field documentation as reddish or reddish-brown in color. It is worth being precise about what this means and what it does not mean. Hair color can change after death due to chemical processes, mineral exposure, and the particular alkaline conditions of desert environments. Researchers have noted that dark hair can shift toward reddish or auburn tones under such conditions over long periods. This is a documented phenomenon, and it is a legitimate variable when interpreting the hair samples from Lovelock. However, It is equally documented that the reddish coloration of the Lovelock hair samples was noted by multiple independent observers across different points in the excavation timeline, not just one account, and not just from sensationalist sources. The Harrington Field Notes reference it. Newspaper accounts from the period reference it. And at least one subsequent laboratory examination of preserved samples, conducted decades later, returned a description consistent with reddish-brown pigmentation. Whether that coloration is the result of post-mortem chemical change or reflects the original pigmentation of the individuals in life is a question that has not been definitively resolved. That is an honest statement of where the science currently stands. Beyond the skeletal material and hair samples, the artifact assemblage recovered from Lovelock Cave is remarkable in its own right. Over 1,000 individual items were catalogued, including finely woven baskets demonstrating a level of technical skill that specialists have described as among the most sophisticated basketry recovered from any North American prehistoric context. Duck decoys, 11 of them were found, constructed from tule reeds and actual feathers, painted and shaped with a level of naturalistic detail that suggests both craft specialization and a deep familiarity with waterfowl behavior. These decoys are now housed at the Nevada State Museum and the Museum of the American Indian. Also recovered were weapons, including what appeared to be large handheld clubs or striking implements, and quantities of burned material in the upper cave deposits that some researchers have interpreted as evidence of a significant burning event at or near the end of the cave's occupation period. The Northern Paiute oral tradition, which we will address in detail in a later chapter, describes a conflict and a fire in connection with this location. The physical evidence of burning in the upper deposits is a documented archaeological fact. The interpretation of what caused it remains open. The measurable record, taken on its own terms, presents a sight that is genuinely unusual. Not fraudulent, not fabricated, but unusual. The skeletal proportions, the hair samples, the sophistication of the artifact assemblage, and the evidence of a terminal burning event are all part of the documented physical record. They are not embellishments. They are the starting point. When L. L. Loud submitted his initial report on Lovelock Cave to the University of California in 1912, the document was notable for its careful, methodical tone. Loud was not writing for a popular audience. He was writing for a scientific institution, and his language reflects that: measured, observational, and precise. His report describes the stratigraphy of the deposits, the distribution of artifact types across different excavation layers, and the condition of the human remains encountered during the dig. What Loud did not do, and what is worth noting, is sensationalize. The physical observations he recorded, including the dimensions of certain skeletal material and the unusual coloration of preserved hair, appear in his report as data points, not conclusions. He describes what was found. He does not construct a narrative around it. M. R. Harrington's follow-up excavations in 1924 produced a more detailed published account. Harrington's 1929 monograph, published by the Museum of the American Indian, is the most comprehensive academic treatment of Lovelock Cave produced during the early period of its study. It includes detailed artifact descriptions, stratigraphic analysis, and discussion of the human remains. The monograph is a matter of public record and can be accessed through university library systems and digital archives. Harrington's report acknowledges the unusual physical characteristics of some of the skeletal material without offering a definitive cultural or biological interpretation. He situates the finds within the broader context of Great Basin prehistory, as it was understood in the 1920s, which was itself a field still being actively constructed. The academic frameworks for interpreting Great Basin populations were not settled at the time of his writing, and Harrington is candid about that uncertainty. Newspaper accounts from Nevada during and after the 1912 excavations are a separate category of documentation valuable for establishing the public record of what was found, but requiring more careful handling. Several Nevada newspapers of the period ran stories on the Lovelock discoveries, and some of those accounts are considerably less restrained than the academic reports. Claims about the height of the remains, the vividness of the hair color, and the overall significance of the finds were amplified in press coverage in ways that the field reports do not support in full. This divergence between the academic record and the popular press record is itself a documented pattern, one that has contributed significantly to the confusion surrounding Lovelock Cave. The more extreme claims that circulate today can frequently be traced back not to Harrington or Loud, but to newspaper accounts that extrapolated well beyond what the excavation reports actually state. Tracking that divergence carefully is important, because it allows us to separate what is genuinely documented from what was added later by sources with less rigorous standards. There is also a documented chain of custody issue with the Lovelock materials that deserves attention. Not all of the remains and artifacts recovered from the cave ended up in institutional collections. The guano mining operation that preceded the formal excavation disturbed an unknown quantity of material before any systematic recording began. Loud himself acknowledged in his report that workers had already removed and discarded significant amounts of cultural material before the University of California became involved. What was lost in that initial disturbance, and what it might have contributed to the physical and material record, cannot be known. Of the materials that were formally catalogued, a portion ended up at the University of California, a portion at the Museum of the American Indian in New York, and a portion at the Nevada State Museum in Carson City. The current status and accessibility of the skeletal remains specifically has changed over time, particularly following the passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990, which established legal frameworks for the return of Native American remains and cultural items to affiliated tribes. Some of the Lovelock human remains have been subject to repatriation discussions, and the accessibility of those materials for further scientific study has been limited as a result. This is not presented here as a criticism of repatriation law or policy. It is presented as a documented fact that affects what physical evidence is currently available for examination and what questions remain, for the time being, unanswerable through direct analysis. We are investigating the timeline they tried to erase. If you want to see the documents I found next video, make sure to subscribe. To understand the Lovelock discoveries accurately, it is necessary to understand the world in which they were made, both the physical world of the Great Basin and the intellectual world of early 20th century American archaeology. The Great Basin is one of the most demanding environments on the North American continent. Stretching across what is now Nevada, Utah, and parts of surrounding states, it is a high desert region defined by internal drainage water flows but does not flow out to the ocean. During wetter climatic periods, large lakes covered significant portions of the basin. Lovelock Cave sits near what was once the shoreline of one such lake, Humboldt Lake, which was itself a remnant of the much larger Pleistocene-era Lake Lahontan. At the time the cave was most intensively occupied, the surrounding environment would have been considerably more resource-rich than the arid landscape visible today, with open water, wetland vegetation, and abundant waterfowl. This context matters because it explains the artifact assemblage in practical terms. The duck decoys, the fishing implements, the quantities of Thule reed construction found in the cave, these are not mysterious. They are the material culture of a people living adjacent to a productive wetland environment. The sophistication of the basketry is consistent with a population that had developed specialized craft skills over many generations in a specific ecological setting. The Northern Paiute people have inhabited the Great Basin for a documented period extending well before European contact. Their oral traditions, recorded by ethnographers beginning in the late 19th century, include accounts of a group referred to in some translations as the Ctach, described as a red-haired, aggressive people who lived on rafts on the lakes and came into conflict with the ancestors of the Paiute. According to these accounts, a coalition of tribes eventually drove the Ctach into a cave and set fire to it. Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins, a Northern Paiute woman who became a prominent writer and activist in the 19th century, included an account of the Ctach in her 1883 book, Life Among the Paiutes, Their Wrongs and Claims. Her account describes the red-haired people as enemies of the Paiute, ultimately destroyed in the manner described above. Winnemucca Hopkins was writing for a non-native audience and had particular rhetorical goals in her text, which is worth keeping in mind when using it as a historical source. But her account predates the Lovelock excavations by nearly 3 decades, which means it cannot have been constructed in response to them. The correlation between the Paiute oral tradition and the physical evidence at Lovelock Cave, including the burned material in the upper deposits, has been noted by multiple researchers. The degree to which that correlation constitutes confirmation of the oral account, as opposed to coincidence or selective interpretation, is a matter of ongoing discussion. What is not in dispute is that the oral tradition exists, that it predates the excavations, and that some of its specific features correspond to details in the physical record. The early 20th century context also shaped how the discoveries were interpreted institutionally. American archaeology in this period was operating within a set of assumptions about the peopling of the Americas that have since been substantially revised. The dominant model of the time held that the Americas were populated relatively recently, by a single migration event across the Bering Land Bridge, producing populations that were relatively homogeneous in physical type. Finds that complicated this picture evidence of greater physical diversity, earlier occupation dates, or cultural complexity that exceeded the expected level for a given period were often either set aside or fitted awkwardly into the existing framework. This is not a claim that the institutions of the period were engaged in deliberate suppression. It is a documented feature of how scientific paradigms work. Anomalies that do not fit the prevailing model tend to be underemphasized until the model itself is ready to change. The history of Great Basin archaeology in the 20th century is, in part, a history of that gradual revision. With the physical evidence and the historical documentation established, it becomes possible to ask a more focused set of questions, not about what was found, but about what the finds mean and what remains unexplained. The first question concerns population. If the skeletal remains at Lovelock include individuals of unusually large stature and potentially distinct physical features, what does that tell us about the population that occupied the cave? There are several possible interpretations. One is that the individuals were simply at the upper end of normal human variation for Great Basin populations taller than average, but not outside the range of biological possibility. Another is that they represent a distinct group or lineage that was present in the region and has not been well accounted for in the existing archaeological record. A third possibility, raised by some physical anthropologists, is that the skeletal analysis conducted in the early 20th century was not sufficiently precise to support confident conclusions about stature, and that modern reanalysis with current methods would produce different results. All three of these interpretations are defensible on the available evidence. None of them has been definitively established, partly because the skeletal material itself is no longer fully accessible for study. The second question concerns the hair. If the reddish coloration observed in the Lovelock hair samples is the result of post-mortem chemical change, it should be replicable under controlled conditions. Researchers should be able to demonstrate the specific chemical pathway by which dark hair becomes reddish-brown in the alkaline conditions of a desert cave over a period of several thousand years. Some work along these lines has been done, and chemical alteration is a legitimate and well-documented process. But the question of whether all of the Lovelock hair samples can be fully explained by that process, or whether some proportion of them reflect original pigmentation, has not been resolved with the level of precision that would allow the question to be closed. The third question is about the artifact assemblage, and what it implies about cultural continuity. The material culture recovered from Lovelock Cave represents a sophisticated, specialized adaptation to a specific environment. The question of how that culture relates to the populations documented in the region at later periods, including the Northern Paiute, is not straightforward. Archaeological cultures do not map neatly onto ethnic or linguistic groups, and the relationship between material assemblage and biological population is complex. But the oral tradition of the Paiute explicitly describes the people of the cave as distinct from themselves, as outsiders, as enemies, as people who were ultimately eliminated. If that oral tradition is taken seriously as historical evidence, it raises questions about population displacement and replacement in the Great Basin that the current archaeological framework addresses only partially. The fourth question concerns the burning event. The physical evidence of fire in the upper cave deposits is documented. The Paiute oral tradition describes a deliberate burning. These two facts correspond. The question is whether that correspondence reflects the genuine historical memory of the event recorded in the cave's stratigraphy, or whether it is a coincidence that has been retrospectively connected. Neither conclusion is unreasonable. But the question deserves more rigorous examination than it has received. The fifth question, and in some ways the most important, is about what we do not have. An unknown quantity of material was removed from Lovelock Cave before formal excavation began. Some of what was formally catalogued has since become unavailable for direct study. The questions that remain open are, at least in part, open because the physical evidence needed to answer them is no longer accessible. That is a factual statement about the current state of the record. It does not imply that the gaps were created intentionally. But it does mean that certain questions about Lovelock Cave cannot be answered with the evidence currently available, and that honest acknowledgement of that limitation is essential to any credible discussion of the site. Every significant archaeological site carries some degree of evidentiary incompleteness. Records are lost, materials are damaged, excavation methods change over time, and institutional priorities shift. Lovelock Cave is not unique in having gaps in its record. But the nature and pattern of those gaps are worth examining carefully, because they affect which questions can still be answered and which cannot. The most significant gap is the one created before formal excavation began. The guano mining operation that preceded the University of California's involvement ran for approximately 1 year before any systematic recording of cultural material took place. Loud's own account acknowledges that workers had encountered and discarded artifacts, and almost certainly human remains, during that period. The scale of that loss is unknown. It is not possible to determine whether the most significant physical evidence, the remains that would most clearly resolve questions about stature, physical type, and population, was among the material discarded during that pre-excavation period. This is not an allegation. It is a structural feature of the site's history that limits what conclusions can be drawn from the surviving record. The second gap involves the chain of institutional custody. Materials from Lovelock Cave ended up distributed across at least 3 separate institutions, and the documentation accompanying each transfer was not always complete or consistent. Some items catalogued in field notes do not appear in institutional collection records. Whether those items were lost, miscatalogued, transferred to private collections, or simply documented imprecisely in the original field notes, is not clear from the available record. The discrepancy exists, and has been noted by researchers who have attempted to reconcile the field documentation with current institutional holdings. A third area of incompleteness involves the skeletal analysis itself. The anthropometric measurements recorded in the early 20th century were conducted using methods and reference standards that have since been revised. The stature estimates derived from femur lengths, for example, were calculated using formulas that modern forensic anthropologists consider less reliable than current methods. A rigorous modern reanalysis of the available skeletal material using current forensic techniques, isotope analysis, and if possible ancient DNA extraction would produce significantly more precise and reliable data than anything currently available. That reanalysis has not been conducted on the Lovelock remains in a comprehensive way, partly due to the repatriation considerations mentioned earlier. There is also a gap in the published literature that is worth noting. Lovelock Cave was the subject of substantial academic attention in the 1920s and 1930s, and then relatively little for several decades. The site reemerged in popular discussion largely through channels outside academic archaeology, through alternative history writers and online communities, before receiving renewed attention from researchers. The result is that the current public understanding of Lovelock Cave is shaped disproportionately by non-academic sources, which have sometimes reproduced the more extreme claims from early newspaper accounts rather than the more careful language of the excavation reports. This gap between the popular record and the academic record is not unique to Lovelock. It is a recurring feature of archaeological sites that attract significant public interest. But it has specific consequences for Lovelock, because it means that the site has been simultaneously overinterpreted in popular culture and underexamined in the academic literature. The questions that genuine anomalies in the record raise have not received the sustained, rigorous scientific attention they would need to be answered or conclusively dismissed. Finally, there is the question of what happened to specific skeletal remains after the repatriation process began. The legal and ethical frameworks governing that process are clear and legitimate. But the scientific consequence is that certain physical evidence is no longer available for the kind of direct analysis that could resolve key questions. This is a real tension between the rights of descendant communities to control the remains of their ancestors and the scientific interest in understanding the full range of human prehistory. That tension is acknowledged here without resolution, because it does not have a simple resolution. It is one of the genuinely difficult features of this area of research. After working through the physical record, the historical documentation, the cultural context, and the gaps in what is currently known, a coherent picture begins to take shape, not a simple one, and not one that resolves cleanly into any single explanation, but a picture that is more complex than the mainstream account and more grounded than the most extreme alternative versions. What the evidence suggests, taken together, is this: Lovelock Cave was occupied over a very long period by at least one population whose physical characteristics and material culture have not been fully integrated into the standard narrative of Great Basin prehistory. The skeletal evidence, however imperfectly recorded, points to individuals of unusual stature. The hair evidence, however complicated by post-mortem chemistry, was noted consistently across multiple independent sources. The artifact assemblage reflects a level of cultural sophistication that is impressive by any standard. And the oral tradition of the Northern Paiute describes a specific conflict with a specific group of people at or near this location, with physical features that correspond to some of what the excavations recovered. None of these individual elements, taken alone, is sufficient to overturn the existing framework. But taken together, they form a pattern that the existing framework explains only partially. The standard account that Lovelock Cave was occupied by ancestral Great Basin populations whose remains fall within normal human variation and whose material culture reflects expected regional development is not wrong, exactly. But it does not account for all of the documented anomalies. It does not explain the hair samples to the satisfaction of every researcher who has examined them. It does not engage fully with the Paiute oral tradition as historical evidence. And it cannot account for the material that was lost before formal excavation began. What the pattern points toward is the possibility that the Great Basin's prehistoric population history was more complicated and possibly more diverse than the current models reflect. That is not a radical claim. Revisions to models of early American population history have been ongoing for decades, driven by ancient DNA research, new excavation methods, and a more serious engagement with indigenous oral traditions as historical sources. Lovelock Cave sits within that larger conversation. The more provocative interpretations that the red-haired people of Lovelock were a separate race, or giants in any literal sense, or evidence of contact with distant civilizations are not supported by the documented record as it stands. They represent extrapolations that go well beyond what the evidence can bear. But the more modest claim that Lovelock Cave contains evidence of a population whose full history has not yet been told is supported by the record. And that is a claim worth taking seriously. Lovelock Cave is not a solved problem. It is a site with a complicated excavation history, a partially preserved physical record, a rich oral tradition attached to it, and a set of documented anomalies that have not been fully explained by the academic frameworks applied to them so far. This video has not argued that any particular theory is correct. What it has done is walk through the layers of documented evidence, the physical measurements, the field reports, the newspaper accounts, the oral histories, the chain of custody issues, and tried to present them clearly enough that the questions they raise become visible on their own terms. The most honest conclusion available is also the most useful one. The full story of who occupied Lovelock Cave, over what period, and what happened to them, has not yet been told. The evidence that would tell it most clearly is partially unavailable, either lost before formal excavation began or restricted from current study. The questions that remain are real questions not invented by alternative historians, but present in the academic record for anyone willing to read it carefully. What is worth resisting is the pressure to resolve those questions prematurely, either by dismissing the anomalies as misinterpretation or by inflating them into certainties they cannot support. The space between those two positions is where careful observation lives. And careful observation is the only tool that has ever actually advanced our understanding of the past. The story of the red-haired people of Nevada remains open. It may not close in our lifetime. But it is worth watching and worth asking the right questions about.